The smell hit me before I even got through the second door. Bleach, wet concrete, old sheets, and something sour I couldn't place. I was standing in a hallway that looked more like the back of an abandoned factory than any kind of medical facility, staring through wired glass at 8 iron beds lined up against stained walls. Then I saw him. My father was on the bed, closest to the radiator, wearing a gray shirt I'd never seen before. His face looked thinner than it had 2 months ago. His hands were shaking on top of a cheap blanket. I knocked on the glass. "Dad." "Nothing." I knocked harder. "Dad, it's me." His eyes finally moved toward me, slow and unfocused. For 1 second, I thought he recognized me. Then he whispered, "Are you the nurse?" My stomach dropped. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. 2 days earlier, my brother Mark had sent me a picture of a beautiful swimming pool, surrounded by palm trees. Under it, he'd written, "Dad loves this place. Says he feels 10 years younger." I was looking at that message while my 75-year-old father stared straight at me like I was a stranger. 3 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. Dad had been slowing down since Mom died, but he wasn't helpless. He was 75, stubborn as hell, and still tried to fix everything around his house himself. He'd worked for the railroad most of his life, and retirement hadn't changed his habits much. He still woke up before 6, made coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and complained whenever somebody paid a contractor for something they could supposedly fix with a wrench and 20 minutes. After Mom passed, though, the house got quiet. When I called, I could usually hear the TV running, even when Dad wasn't watching it. Sometimes he forgot where he'd left his glasses. Once he left a pot on the stove until the smoke alarm went off. Nothing that made me think he couldn't take care of himself, but enough that I'd started worrying about him living alone. I lived almost 2,000 miles away because of my engineering job, so most of the day-to-day stuff fell on my older brother, Mark. He lived about 20 minutes from Dad. Mark and I had never been close. He was the kind of guy who could somehow turn buying a new truck into a personal victory over everyone he knew. Bigger house, expensive watch, business class flights, steak dinners, everything had to be photographed and shown off. He'd started a construction company years earlier and talked about it like he was running half the state. I never knew how much money he actually had. 1 month, he'd be bragging about some huge contract, and the next, he'd complain that clients hadn't paid him. Dad always defended him. "Your brother works hard," he'd tell me. Maybe he did. I just never liked how badly Mark needed everyone to believe he was successful. Then one Sunday night, Mark called me while I was sitting at my kitchen counter finishing work on my laptop. He didn't even say hello properly. "Listen, man, I think I found the answer for Dad." I stopped typing. "What answer?" he said. "I'm sending you something. Just look before you start asking questions." A link popped up in our chat. I opened it and found a private senior medical complex about an hour outside our hometown. The place looked ridiculous. Huge pool, private rooms, gardens, physical therapy, spa treatments, nurses around the clock. The photos looked more like a resort than a care facility. There were older couples drinking coffee on balconies and smiling like they were on vacation. I kept scrolling and finally said, "Dude, there's no way Dad can afford this." Mark laughed. "He doesn't have to." I stopped scrolling. "What does that mean?" "I'll cover most of it." That surprised me enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at his name on the screen. Mark wasn't cheap exactly, but he liked spending money where people could see it. Quietly paying for Dad's medical care didn't sound like him. How much is most? 70%. 70% of what? This place has to cost a fortune. About 12 grand a month with the medical package. Holy shit, Mark. I know, but look at what he gets. Private room, doctors, physical therapy, meals, people around him all day. If his memory gets worse, they handle that too. You keep saying you're worried about him being alone. Well, here you go. I hated how much sense it made. I looked through the photos again. Dad was spending almost every day alone in a house that was getting harder for him to maintain. This place looked safe, comfortable. Honestly, it looked better than anything I could have arranged from across the country. Still, something bothered me. So what's the catch? So, Mark paused. Just for a second. There's no catch. Dad covers the other 30%. With what money? The house. I didn't answer immediately. Dad's place wasn't a mansion, but it was a large old cottage on almost an acre. Mom and Dad had bought it decades ago, and property prices had exploded since then. Mark said, "Think about it. If he moves, why keep an empty house? We sell it, use his part to pay the facility years in advance, and I cover the rest. No property taxes, no repairs, no sitting there alone at night." You already talked to him? Yeah, he's being stubborn. Keeps talking about Mom and the house. Of course he is. Talk to him, he listens to you. The next evening, I called Dad. He sounded tired before we even got into it. Mark told you about this place, huh? Yeah, I looked at it. And? It looks pretty damn nice. Dad was quiet. Then he said, "Your mother picked the curtains in this room, those ugly flower ones. Remember them?" I smiled. Yeah. She'd kill me if I sold this place. Dad. I know she's gone. I'm not confused about that. I didn't say you were, he sighed. I just don't like the idea of strangers living here. We talked for almost an hour. I told him he'd have doctors nearby, people his age around. No stairs to worry about, no yard work, no sitting alone all winter. He kept asking me whether I really thought he should do it. Finally, I said yes. That was the sentence I'd replay in my head later. A week after Dad signed the sale papers, Mark sent me a photo from the driveway. Dad stood beside Mark's new black SUV holding one suitcase. Mark had his arm around his shoulders and was grinning at the camera. The message underneath said, "Big day. Taking the old man to his new life." I called immediately. Mark answered from inside the car. "Put Dad on." "Can't, I'm driving." "Use Bluetooth." "Relax, man. He'll call you when we get there." I heard Dad say something in the background. "Dad?" I said. Mark laughed. "He says hi." Then the call ended. Dad never called that night. I waited until almost 10, then texted Mark asking if they'd made it safely. He answered about 20 minutes later. "Yeah, long day. Dad's exhausted. They gave him something to help him sleep." I stared at that message longer than I should have. I wanted to call the facility myself, but I figured Dad had just moved out of the house he'd lived in for more than 30 years. Of course he was exhausted. I texted back, "Tell him I love him." Mark sent a thumbs up. The next morning, he sent me a picture of a breakfast tray with eggs, fruit, coffee, and orange juice. "Dad eating better than both of us now," he wrote. There was no Dad in the picture, just the tray. I noticed that, but again I didn't make anything of it. I was busy at work. Mark was physically there. And I kept telling myself, I needed to stop trying to control everything from 2,000 miles away. 3 days later, I tried Dad's cell. It rang twice, then disconnected. I called again. Same thing. A minute later, Mark texted me. "Dad's doing physical therapy right now. Phones aren't allowed in the treatment rooms." I asked when he'd be done. Mark said he'd have him call me afterward. No call came. The next day I tried around lunchtime. This time Dad's phone went straight to voicemail. Mark called me almost immediately. "Dude, seriously, you gotta stop blowing up his phone." I frowned. I called him once. Mark sighed like I was being difficult. "He's adjusting. The doctor says too much outside stress isn't good right now." I actually laughed. "Outside stress? I'm his son." "I know that. Nobody said you weren't." "Then put him on the phone." There was a pause. "He's on an IV." "For what?" "Hydration, vitamins, whatever. I'm not a doctor." I asked for the doctor's name. Mark got irritated. "What the hell is this, an interrogation? I'm handling it." "You wanted Dad somewhere safe, remember?" That shut me up, mostly because he was right about one thing. I had supported the move. I'd pushed Dad toward it. So I backed off for a few days. Mark started sending updates without me asking. Dad had supposedly started pool therapy. Dad liked one of the nurses. Dad had made friends with another retired guy who used to work construction. Every update sounded exactly like something I wanted to hear. Then the photos started coming. One showed the resort pool under bright sunlight. Another showed a fancy dining room. Another showed a garden with a little walking path and benches. The weird thing was Dad wasn't in any of them. When I asked about it, Mark replied, "You know how he is with pictures. He hates cameras." That was true. Dad did hate having his picture taken. Still, I wrote, "Just get one next time. I want to see him." 2 days later, Mark sent a photo of Dad sitting in what looked like a nice leather chair near a large window. He was wearing a blue sweater and looking down at a newspaper. His face was partly turned away, but it was definitely him. "See?" Mark wrote. "Happy now?" I zoomed in on the picture. Dad looked tired, but nothing seemed obviously wrong. I called Mark. "When was this taken?" He said, "Like 20 minutes ago. Can I talk to him?" Mark groaned. He literally just fell asleep. I looked at the photo again. 20 minutes ago, he was reading the paper, and now he's asleep? "Yeah, old people take naps, man. What do you want me to tell you?" His voice had that edge I remembered from when we were teenagers, the one he used whenever he wanted to make you feel stupid for asking a normal question. I told him to have Dad call me when he woke up. Mark said, "Sure." Again, the call never came. By the third week, I wasn't even calling Dad directly anymore because every attempt ended the same way. His phone was off, or Mark answered somehow, or I got a text explaining why Dad couldn't talk. Treatments, therapy, sleeping, doctor's orders. Once Mark told me Dad had gotten worked up after asking about the old house, so the staff wanted to limit family calls for a few days. That one bogged me. I said, "Why would talking to me get him worked up?" Mark replied, "It's not you. He gets emotional about Mom and the house. They're trying to establish a routine." I asked him to give me the number for Dad's room. He said the rooms didn't have direct lines. I asked for the nurse's station. He told me he'd send it later. He never did. Meanwhile, the house sold fast. Mark told me they'd gotten $350,000 for it, which was more than Dad expected. I asked where the money went. "Straight into the care arrangement," Mark said. Dad signed everything. I wanted copies of the paperwork for my records. Mark laughed. "Your records? Since when are you Dad's accountant?" "Since he's 75 and just sold the biggest thing he owns." Mark got quiet, then said, "Fine. I'll scan it when I get a chance." A week passed. Nothing. When I asked again, he said his office scanner was broken. That excuse was so stupid I almost called him out right there. But I didn't. I still wasn't thinking fraud. I thought Mark was being lazy, controlling, maybe enjoying the fact that for once he was the brother handling everything while I was far away. Then almost 2 months passed without me hearing Dad's voice. That was when the excuses stopped sounding annoying and started sounding wrong. On a Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in my office when Mark sent another picture. It showed the same beautiful pool from the facility's website, bright blue water, white lounge chairs, trees in the background. His message said, "Your old man did 10 laps today. Wouldn't shut up about it." I stared at it and felt something tighten in my chest. Dad hadn't done 10 laps of anything in years. His left knee bothered him just walking through a grocery store. I called Mark. "What?" he answered. "Put Dad on. He's showering." "Then I'll wait." "What?" I said I'll wait. Put the phone down outside the bathroom. When he comes out, give it to him. Mark didn't answer. "Mark." "Man, I'm leaving. I've got a meeting." "Then give me the facility number." "I already told you. I'll send it." "No. Send it right now." Another silence. Then he said, "Why are you acting like this?" I looked at the pool picture again, because I haven't heard my father's voice in almost 2 months. "He's fine." "Good. Then this should take 30 seconds. Mark's voice changed. "Listen, don't come down here starting drama. Dad needs peace right now." I didn't argue. I just said, "Okay." That night, I opened my work calendar, canceled everything I could, and requested a week off. I didn't tell Mark. I didn't tell Dad. because I couldn't reach him anyway. I booked the earliest flight I could find, reserved a rental car, and saved the address from the medical facility's brochure. I was going to surprise my father. At least that's what I told myself. My flight landed a little after 11 in the morning. I picked up the rental car, threw my bag in the back, and drove straight toward the facility. I didn't even stop for lunch. The whole drive, I kept imagining Dad's reaction when I walked into his room. I figured he'd call me an idiot for spending money on a last-minute flight, then hug me anyway. I'd already decided I wasn't leaving until I heard directly from his doctor about whatever treatment had supposedly kept him from talking to me. If Mark got pissed, fine. At that point, I didn't care. I just wanted to see Dad with my own eyes. About an hour later, the road curved through this expensive little town full of golf courses, gated communities, and restaurants where every car in the parking lot looked newer than mine. Then I saw the sign from the brochure and actually felt myself relax. The place was real. Same stone entrance, same gardens, same huge main building. For the first time in weeks, I thought maybe I'd been making myself crazy over nothing. Inside, it looked exactly like the website. There was soft music playing near the lobby, fresh flowers on a table, and two women behind a polished front desk. I walked up, smiling, and said, "Hey, I'm here to see my father. I wanted to surprise him." One of the women smiled back. "Of course. What's his name?" "Thomas." I gave her our last name and waited while she typed. Her smile disappeared. She typed again. "Could you spell the last name for me?" I did. She checked something else, then looked at the woman beside her. "And he's currently staying with us?" "Yeah, he moved in almost 2 months ago." She shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not finding anyone by that name." I laughed because I honestly thought it was some computer problem. "Try Thomas with no middle initial." She did. Nothing. "Maybe Mark put him under a shortened name. Tom?" Nothing. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo Mark had sent me of Dad in the leather chair. "That's him. He's here." The woman looked at the picture, then back at me. "I don't recognize him, but we have a lot of residents." "Okay, check admissions. He came in about 8 weeks ago." She asked for Dad's date of birth. I gave it to her. Still nothing. My mouth started getting dry. "Can you check people who left? Maybe he got transferred somewhere." She said she couldn't discuss private records beyond confirming a current resident without authorization. I leaned closer to the desk. "Listen, I'm not asking for medical information. I'm telling you my 75-year-old father is supposed to be living here, and you're telling me he doesn't exist." The second woman picked up the phone and quietly called someone. A man in a dark suit came out a few minutes later and introduced himself as the facility's security manager. He asked me to come into his office. I remember thinking that was either very good or very bad. Once the door closed, he asked for Mark's full name. I gave it to him. His expression changed immediately. "Do you have a photo of your brother?" I pulled up one from Mark's social media. The man stared at it for maybe 5 seconds and said, "Yes, I remember him." My whole body went cold. "So Dad was here." He shook his head. "No, your brother was." I just stared at him. He turned his monitor slightly away from me and started searching through something. "He came for a consultation about 3 months ago. I was involved because there was an issue during the financial screening." "What issue?" "He never completed the admission process." I felt my fingers tighten around my phone. "He told me he signed a long-term care agreement." "He did not." "You sure?" "Yes." "He said his company was paying 70%. The man looked uncomfortable. "I shouldn't discuss another person's financial information, but considering what you're telling me, I think you need to contact law enforcement." That sentence scared the hell out of me. "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Your brother attempted to place a deposit during the consultation. The payment was declined. Our finance department requested another form of payment, and he became upset. He left with several promotional brochures. There was never an admission contract." I couldn't speak for a few seconds. All I could hear was the air conditioner above us. Finally, I said, My father sold his house for $350,000 because Mark told us he was coming here. The security manager stopped moving. He picked Dad up himself, I continued. He told me he brought him here. He's been sending me pictures from this place for almost 2 months. The man leaned back. Pictures from our property? I showed him the pool photo. He looked at it and said, "That's from our public website." I swiped to the dining room. Also from the website. Then the garden. Website. My hand started shaking. I opened the picture of Dad in the leather chair. What about this? He looked carefully. That's not here. You're sure? I'm sure? I called Mark right there. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Then I called Dad's phone. It rang once and shut off. I tried again. Off. The security manager said something about calling the police, but I barely heard him. My head was filling with numbers. $350,000. Mark's new SUV. Dad's house sold. No contract, no Dad. 2 months without hearing his voice. I walked out of that building feeling like the ground was moving under me. In the parking lot, I called Mark again. Nothing. I sent one text. Call me now. Then I sat in the rental car and stared at Dad's contact photo. It was an old picture of him standing beside his grill, holding a beer and squinting into the sun. I suddenly remembered our last real conversation. The curtains, Mom, the house, him asking me whether I really thought he should sell, and me telling him yes. My phone buzzed. For half a second, I thought it was Mark. It wasn't. It was an automatic notification from Dad's phone account. Months earlier, I'd helped him set up location sharing because he kept losing the damn thing. I opened the app without really expecting anything. The phone was offline. But underneath that, there was one last recorded location from 6 days earlier. It wasn't anywhere near the resort. It was on the far edge of the state, near an industrial district, beside a freight rail line. I took a screenshot and called the first private investigator I could find who answered the phone. The investigator's name was Ray. I found him through a local agency and probably sounded insane when he answered. My father is missing. My brother lied about putting him in a medical facility, and I have one location from his phone. Ray didn't waste time asking why I hadn't called the police first. He just said, "Send me the location and everything you have on your father and brother." I forwarded the screenshot, Dad's photo, Mark's information, the address of the resort, and the picture Mark had claimed was taken there. Then I called the local police and filed a missing person report. The officer asked when I'd last spoken directly to Dad, saying, almost 2 months ago, out loud, made me feel sick. "And you believed he was in a care facility that entire time?" "Yeah." "Who told you that?" "My brother." There was a pause. "Do you have documentation showing your father was admitted?" "No." Another pause. "Sir, stay available by phone." Ray called me back 20 minutes later. "That location you sent me isn't residential." I was still sitting in the resort parking lot. "What is it?" "Industrial area. Warehouses, freight yards, a couple shelters, some old medical buildings. Could be nothing. Phones bounce off towers sometimes. Dad doesn't know anybody there." "Okay, don't jump ahead yet. I'm driving over." I told him I was coming too. He immediately said, "No. Meet me at the gas station about 2 miles from the pin. Don't go walking into random buildings." The drive took almost 3 hours. I called Mark at least 10 times. Every call went straight to voicemail. Then, about halfway there, he finally texted me, "In meetings all day. What's up?" I stared at the screen and felt my jaw tighten. I typed, "Nothing. Just checking on Dad." Mark answered almost immediately, "He's good. Pool therapy this morning. Taking a nap now." I read that message 3 times. For the first time, I knew for a fact he was lying. I wanted to write, "Where the hell is he?" Instead, I typed, "Nice. Tell him I called." Mark sent, "Will do." I put the phone down and kept driving. The farther I went, the worse the area got. Nice suburbs turned into old strip malls, then warehouses, truck lots, chain-link fences, and long stretches of road, with almost nobody around. Freight trains ran parallel to the highway for miles. By the time I reached the gas station, the sky was getting dark. Ray was waiting in an old gray pickup. He looked to be in his late 50s. Baseball cap, jeans. Nothing about him screamed private investigator. He walked over, holding a tablet. "You the son?" "Yeah." He showed me a map. Last location puts the phone somewhere inside this block. There are 6 buildings that make sense. 2 are warehouses. One's abandoned. One is a temporary shelter. One's some kind of low-cost, assisted housing operation. The last one used to be a rehab center. Which one do we check first? The assisted housing place. We drove separately and parked across the street. The building was gray concrete, 3 stories, with narrow windows covered by metal bars. There wasn't a sign out front, except a small plastic plaque beside the door. Ray looked at it through binoculars and said, "This place has changed names 3 times in 5 years." "What does that mean?" "Usually nothing good." I started opening my door. He grabbed my arm. "Don't. My father could be in there. And if he is, running inside screaming isn't going to help him. We ask questions first." I hated hearing it, but he was right. We crossed the street. The front door was locked. Ray pressed a buzzer. After almost a minute, a woman's voice came through a speaker. "Yes?" Ray said we were looking for a family member. The lock buzzed. Inside was a tiny lobby separated from the rest of the building by thick glass. The smell was the first thing I noticed. Disinfectant, damp clothes, old food. A woman sat behind a small window. She barely looked up. "Name?" I gave Dad's full name. She typed for a few seconds. "Nobody here by that name." My heart started pounding. "Can you check again?" I checked. I showed her Dad's picture through the glass. "Have you seen this man?" She looked at it for maybe half a second. "No." Ray stepped closer. "Could he be registered under another name?" The woman finally looked at him. "Why would he be?" "That's what we're trying to find out. You need to leave." I said, "My father is 75 years old. He's missing. His phone was tracked to this property." Her face changed. It was small, but I saw it. She looked toward a door behind her. Ray saw it too. He quietly said, "Call the detective handling the missing person report." I pulled out my phone. Before I could dial, I heard something behind the glass. A metal cart rolled past the hallway entrance. A man in scrubs was pushing it. Behind him, through another doorway, I could see part of a room with several beds. Then an older man slowly sat up on one of them. I only saw the side of his face for maybe 2 seconds. "Dad?" The woman stood up. "Sir, you need to leave now." I slammed my palm against the glass. "Dad!" The man in the room turned his head. It was him. I started toward the locked interior door, but Ray got between me and it. "Call the police, right now." "That's my father." "I know. Call them." The woman behind the window was already on a phone. "Security to reception." I dialed emergency services and gave the address. My voice was shaking so badly, I had to repeat it twice. "My missing father is inside this building. They're refusing to let me see him." Then Dad appeared again at the end of the hallway. A staff member was holding him under the arm. Dad could barely stand. His head hung forward, and his legs looked like they were about to fold underneath him. I pressed both hands against the glass. "Dad, it's me." He slowly lifted his face and looked directly at me. There was nothing in his eyes. No surprise, no recognition, nothing. The police got there in maybe 12 minutes, but it felt like an hour. By then, 2 men had come into the lobby and were standing behind the locked interior door. One wore scrubs. The other had a security jacket that looked 2 sizes too big. The woman behind the glass kept saying we were disturbing the residents. I didn't care. I could still see Dad through the hallway doorway every few seconds. Somebody had put him back in bed. "What did you give him?" I shouted. "Why can't he stand?" The woman ignored me. Ray stayed beside me and kept saying, "Don't touch anything. Let the cops see this exactly how it is." When 2 officers finally walked through the front door, I showed them the missing person report, Dad's photo, Mark's messages, and the last location from his phone. One officer went to the glass and said, "Open the door." The woman shook her head. Residents are medically vulnerable. He repeated it. Open the door. A man who introduced himself as the administrator came down the hallway. He looked nervous before anyone even asked him a question. There seems to be some confusion, he said through the glass. I pointed toward the room. That man in there is my father. The administrator looked at Dad's photo on my phone, then at me. We don't have anyone registered under that name. I don't give a damn what name you have. That's him. One of the officers asked the administrator to unlock the door so they could verify Dad's identity. He started talking about privacy laws and medical authorization. The officer cut him off. We have an active missing person case and a family member identifying someone inside your facility. Open the door. The administrator hesitated. That was enough. The second officer stepped aside, called his supervisor, and within minutes, more police were on the way. When the door finally opened, I tried to go straight toward Dad, but an officer stopped me. Stay with me. We walked down the hallway together. The place looked worse beyond the lobby. Paint was peeling near the floor. One ceiling tile had a brown water stain spreading across it. There were old wheelchairs parked against the wall and plastic bags full of linens piled beside a laundry cart. People were lying in rooms with 4, 6, sometimes 8 beds. Some were awake and staring at us. Others didn't move. I could hear a television somewhere playing way too loud. When we reached Dad's room, I stopped so fast the officer nearly walked into me. Dad was lying on his back with his eyes half open. His cheeks had sunk in. His beard had grown out unevenly, and there was dried food on the front of his shirt. I grabbed his hand. It was cold. Dad, hey, it's me. His eyes moved toward my face. I waited. Nothing. Dad, come on, look at me. His lips moved. I leaned closer. What? He whispered something I couldn't understand. Then he asked, where's the bus? I looked at the officer. He doesn't know who I am. The officer asked Dad his name. Dad gave a name I'd never heard before. No, I said. His name is Thomas. The officer looked toward the administrator. We need his file. The administrator brought a thin folder. The name on it was Harold Miller. The birth date was wrong. The address was listed as unknown. Family contact said none. According to the paperwork, this Harold Miller was a homeless man with cognitive impairment who had been transferred from a temporary outreach program. I said, this is fake. Every damn thing on this page is fake. The officer asked who had admitted him. The administrator flipped through several forms. A family acquaintance brought him in with a medical referral. Name? The administrator swallowed. Mark. He gave our last name. I felt Ray grab my shoulder before I even realized I'd stepped forward. Where is the referral? I asked. The administrator handed it to the officer instead of me. The officer read it, then asked, who's the doctor who signed this? The administrator gave a name. Ray was already searching it on his phone. A few seconds later, he looked at me. That doctor retired 4 years ago. The administrator's face went white. Then a nurse came into the room, carrying Dad's medication chart. One officer asked what Dad had been given. She started listing drugs I didn't recognize. I heard sedative, sleep, agitation, anxiety. I said, he didn't have any of that before. He took blood pressure pills and something for his knee. That's it. The nurse looked uncomfortable. His referral said he had severe behavioral episodes. He doesn't. Sir, I only follow the physician's orders. How much are you giving him? She looked down at the chart. The officer took it from her. I leaned over Dad again. Dad, listen to me. You're safe. I found you. His eyes stayed on mine for a few seconds. Then his forehead tightened slightly. His fingers moved inside my hand. Thomas, I said. Your name is Thomas. I'm your son. His lips trembled. For 1 second, I saw something change in his face. Then he whispered my childhood nickname. I almost lost it right there. I squeezed his hand and said, Yeah, Dad. It's me. An ambulance was called. While paramedics checked him, police started photographing the room and collecting paperwork. One officer pulled me into the hallway. We need to talk about your brother. I handed him my phone. Start with the house, he said. So I told him everything: the resort, the 70%, the sale, the $350,000, Mark's new SUV, the fake photos, 2 months of lies. The officer listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question: "Does Mark know you found your father?" I looked at my phone. "No." "Keep it that way." Dad was taken out on a stretcher about 20 minutes later. I walked beside him all the way to the ambulance, holding his hand whenever the paramedics weren't working around me. He kept drifting in and out. Once he opened his eyes and said my nickname again, but then he asked where Mom was. I didn't answer. I just told him, "I'm right here, Dad. You're getting out of this place." One of the paramedics asked how long he'd been taking the medication listed on the chart. "I don't know. I didn't even know he was here until today." The guy looked at me, then back at Dad. "We'll run everything at the hospital." I asked if I could ride with them. He said yes. Before I got in, Ray pulled me aside and said he'd stay with the police and help organize everything we'd collected. "Don't call your brother," he said. "Not yet." I nodded. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket. It was Mark. I let it ring. At the hospital, doctors took Dad straight through the emergency department. I sat in a plastic chair outside the treatment area with my phone in my hands. Mark called again. Then he texted, "You called? Everything okay?" 5 minutes later, another message came through. "Dad's sleeping right now, if that's why you're calling." I read it and actually felt cold. Dad was 20 feet away from me, while Mark was still pretending he was at the resort. I typed, "Yeah, just wanted to check on him." Mark replied, "He's good, man. Don't worry so much." I wanted to smash the phone against the wall. A doctor finally came out almost an hour later. She asked me to step into a small consultation room. "Your father is stable," she said. I excelled for what felt like the first time all day. Then she added, "But I'm concerned about the amount of sedating medication in his system." I asked what that meant. She explained that Dad had several drugs in his blood that could cause extreme drowsiness, confusion, poor balance, memory problems, and low blood pressure, especially in someone his age. "Could that be why he didn't recognize me?" I asked. "It could absolutely contribute." "Is it permanent?" "We don't know yet. We need time. We're stopping anything that isn't medically necessary and monitoring him closely." I rubbed both hands over my face. He was normal before this, forgetful sometimes, sure, but he knew everybody. He drove, he cooked, he paid his own bills, the doctor nodded. "That's important information." She asked about his medical history, medications, previous diagnoses. I gave her everything I knew. Then I asked whether he could be transferred somewhere private once he was stable. I didn't care what it cost. I just wanted him somewhere I trusted. She said they could arrange it after the immediate evaluation. Ray called while I was still waiting. Police found more problems with the paperwork. I walked outside so nobody could hear me. "What kind of problems?" "The referral looks forged. The physician listed on it says he never examined your father and didn't sign anything. They're checking signatures now." "And the facility just accepted him?" "Looks like Mark presented your dad as a homeless, disabled man with no family, cash arrangement, minimal questions." My grip tightened around the phone. "Cash?" "Yeah, very little compared to what a real care facility costs." "So, where's the money from the house?" "That's the next question." Ray told me detectives had already started requesting records from the title company and the bank that handled the sale. Because Dad was alive, the situation was complicated, but the documents from the shelter and the missing person report gave them enough to start moving fast. Then Ray asked, "Do you know what your brother paid for that SUV?" I didn't. "Looks like he bought it less than a week after the house closed." I leaned against the hospital wall. "You're kidding." "No." My phone buzzed again. Mark had sent me another message. "Might take Dad out for steak tomorrow if he feels up to it." I showed Ray the text by sending him a screenshot. He called me right back. "Good. Keep talking to him normally. Don't accuse him of anything. What are you thinking?" Let the detectives decide that. But if Mark thinks you still believe him, he won't run. I looked through the glass doors toward the hallway where Dad was being treated. I want him arrested. I know. No, Ray, you don't understand. I convinced Dad to sell that house. That's exactly why you need to stay calm now. Later that evening, Dad was moved to a private medical unit across town. He was still weak, but his speech was getting a little clearer. I sat beside his bed while he slept. Around 9, he woke up and looked around the room. His eyes landed on me. Where am I? In the hospital. He swallowed. Why? I moved my chair closer. Do you remember Mark taking you somewhere? Dad stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he whispered, he said it was temporary. My heart started pounding. What was temporary? The place. Did he tell you it was the resort? Dad slowly shook his head. He said there was a problem with my room. Said I'd stay somewhere else for 2 nights. I leaned closer. And then? Dad's eyes filled with confusion. I kept asking for my phone. What happened to it? He took it. I didn't say anything. Dad looked at me and whispered, I thought you knew. My throat closed. No, Dad. He turned his face toward the window. I didn't know. My phone started ringing. Mark. I stared at his name for 3 seconds, then answered. Hey, man, I said. Mark sounded completely relaxed. You busy? Not anymore. Good. I need to talk to you about some tax paperwork from Dad's house. I looked at Dad lying beside me, then I said, Funny, I was actually going to call you about the same thing. Mark laughed. Perfect. Saves me a call tomorrow. I walked out of Dad's room and pulled the door almost shut behind me. Actually, I've got some paperwork too. My accountant says there might be a deduction connected to Dad's medical expenses. There was a short pause. Your accountant? Yeah. I mentioned that you were covering 70% of the resort, and he said there might be something we can do. Mark's voice changed immediately. He sounded interested. Oh, yeah, maybe. I'd have to see what you've got. I looked through the little window in Dad's door. He was lying there with his eyes closed. I can bring it tomorrow, Mark said. Email it. Can't. He needs originals for some reason. I let a couple seconds pass. How about Dad's old house? It's empty, right? Mark didn't answer immediately. It's sold. I know, but you said the buyers weren't moving in right away. That was something he'd told me weeks earlier. Yeah, I think we can get onto the porch. Why? I'm flying home tomorrow night. Easier than driving all the way to your place. Mark thought about it. Then he said, Fine, 7? 7 works. Before hanging up, I forced myself to ask, How's Dad? Mark didn't hesitate. Great. Seriously, man, best decision we made. He was in the pool again today. I looked through the glass at Dad. Good, I said. Tell him I love him. Will do. The second the call ended, I called the detective whose number Ray had given me. I explained the meeting. He told me not to go to the house alone and not to change anything. If he contacts you, keep acting normal. Don't threaten him. Don't tell him what you know. I asked if they could arrest him already. The detective said they were working on it. They had the forged referral, statements from the facility, and proof Dad had been admitted under a false identity. But they were still pulling financial records. We want this done right, he said. If we move too early, he starts explaining everything away. Give us tonight. I barely slept. I stayed in the chair beside Dad until after midnight. Every hour or so, he woke up a little clearer. He remembered my name consistently now. He remembered the house. He remembered Mark picking him up. Some parts after that were still broken. He said Mark had driven for a long time and told him there had been a paperwork problem at the resort. Dad remembered asking why the temporary building looked so bad. Mark told him it was a medical intake center. He said I'd be there 2 nights, Dad whispered. Then every time I asked to leave, they gave me medicine. I asked whether Mark ever came back. Dad frowned. Once, maybe twice. I don't know. The next morning, the doctor said Dad's condition was improving faster than she'd expected. That was the first good news I'd heard since landing. She still wanted him monitored, but she said much of the confusion appeared consistent with overmedication rather than a sudden, major decline. I stepped into the hallway and just stood there for a minute, with my forehead against the wall. I didn't realize how badly I'd been preparing myself to hear that my father might never come back mentally. Around noon, Ray arrived, carrying a folder. "You need to see this." We went downstairs to the cafeteria and sat in the far corner. He opened the folder and slid several pages toward me. The house had sold for exactly $350,000. After closing costs and a few old bills, more than $330,000 had been transferred into an account Dad had authorized for his care. 3 days later, almost all of it moved again. "To where?" I asked. "Company controlled by Mark." I stared at him. Ray pointed at another page. "Then it starts splitting. Car dealership, credit cards, business debt, personal account, cash withdrawals. How much is left?" "From what we can see, almost nothing." I felt my teeth pressed together. He spent Dad's entire house. "Looks that way." Then Ray slid over another sheet. "And Mark's company isn't doing well. It's drowning." There were liens, overdue loans, creditor claims and payments I didn't understand. Ray explained them in plain English. Mark hadn't offered to pay 70% of Dad's care because he was successful. He was broke. The resort had declined his card because creditors were already closing in on him. The whole thing had been planned around Dad's house. My phone buzzed. "Mark, still good for 7? I showed Ray. He said, "Answer him." I typed, "Yep. See you there." At 6:30, I left the hospital after telling Dad I'd be back later. He squeezed my hand and said, "Don't do anything stupid." I almost laughed. Even drugged half to hell, he was still my dad. "I won't." When I reached his old neighborhood, I parked 2 streets away, exactly where the detective had told me. The house looked strange without Dad's truck in the driveway. Dark windows, empty porch. The flower bed Mom used to obsess over was already full of weeds. At 6:58, headlights turned onto the street. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. Mark stepped out wearing an expensive jacket and holding his phone. He looked around, saw me near the porch, and smiled. "Man," he said, walking toward me, "you look like shit." I kept my face still. "Long week," he laughed. "Come on, let's see these tax papers." Then headlights came on behind him. Mark turned around. 2 unmarked cars were blocking the driveway. Mark stopped halfway up the porch steps. For a second, nobody moved. Then the doors of both cars opened. 2 detectives stepped out, followed by a uniformed deputy. Mark looked at them, then at me. His smile disappeared. "What is this?" I didn't answer. One detective walked toward him. "Mark, keep your hands where I can see them." Mark actually laughed. It was short and nervous. "Seriously? What the hell is going on?" "Hands where I can see them." Mark slowly lifted both hands. Then he looked at me again. "Did you call these guys?" I stared at him. "How was Dad's pool therapy today?" His face changed, not much, just enough. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I stepped down from the porch. "You said he was swimming this morning. How'd it go?" Mark's eyes moved from me to the detectives. "I don't know what you're talking about." The detective told him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Mark immediately started arguing. "Hold on. You can't just show up and put cuffs on me. What am I being arrested for?" The detective began reading the charges they had authorization for at that point, including fraud, forgery, and unlawful restraint, connected to a vulnerable adult. Mark stopped talking when he heard Dad mentioned, then he snapped his head toward me. "You went there?" I felt something in my chest tighten. "Where, Mark? Don't play this shit with me." "Say it. Where did I go?" He looked away. That was the first moment I knew he understood exactly how bad things were. The deputy cuffed him. Mark started talking fast. Dad agreed to everything. He knew the resort wasn't available yet. It was temporary. He signed papers. I said, He was there for almost 2 months under a fake name. That wasn't my idea. I almost stepped toward him. One detective moved between us. Stay back. Mark kept going. That place handled the paperwork. I didn't make those rules. The detective said, "We have the referral." Mark went silent. "We also spoke with the doctor whose name appears on it." Mark's face went pale. The detective continued, "He says he never met your father and never signed that document." Mark looked at me again. "Listen, man, I can explain." I laughed once because I couldn't believe he'd actually said it. "Explain what? The fake name? The drugs? Taking his phone? Which part?" "I didn't drug anybody. You left him there. It was temporary. 2 months. I was fixing things." "What things?" Mark pulled against the cuffs. "My company had a cash flow problem, that's it. I needed time." There it was. The detectives exchanged a look. One of them said, "You should probably stop talking." Mark ignored him. "The money wasn't gone. It was invested in the company. Once the next contracts paid out, I was going to put everything back." "You bought a car. That's a company vehicle. You paid your credit cards." His eyes narrowed. "How the hell do you know that?" A car door opened behind the detectives. My lawyer stepped out, holding a thick folder. I'd spoken to him earlier that day after Ray found the transfers. Mark recognized him immediately. His shoulders dropped. My lawyer didn't say anything to him. He just handed one of the detectives several documents. Mark stared at the folder. "What's that?" Nobody answered. "What the hell is that?" The detective looked through the first few pages. "Financial records." Mark turned toward me. "You went through my accounts?" "I found Dad." "You had no right to touch my business." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Your business?" "You stole 300 grand from a 75-year-old man and dumped him in a place for homeless people." "I borrowed it." "Dad didn't lend you anything. He signed the transfer. He thought he was paying for medical care." Mark's jaw tightened. "You don't know what he thought." That sentence nearly broke whatever control I had left. I stepped closer until the detective put a hand against my chest. "He thought he was going to a resort because you told him that." "I thought he was going to a resort because you told me that. You sent me pictures from their website while Dad was lying in an 8-bed room so drugged he couldn't remember my name." Mark looked at the ground. For once, he had nothing to say. Then his whole attitude changed. The anger disappeared, and suddenly he sounded scared. "How is he?" I stared at him. "Seriously, is Dad okay? Now you care?" "He's my father, too." "No, don't do that. I'm asking if he's okay." "He thought I knew." Mark frowned. "When I found him, he thought I knew you'd put him there. He thought both of his sons had agreed to it." Mark looked away. I said, "He asked for his phone. You took it." "He kept calling people." "Yeah, Mark, that's what phones are for." He was confused. He wasn't confused until they started pumping him full of sedatives. "I didn't tell them to do that." "You told them he had no family." Mark went quiet again. The detective guided him toward the car. That was when Mark started fighting the situation for real. Not physically, but with words. "Wait, call my attorney. I'm not saying anything else. This is bullshit. Dad signed everything. You're twisting this." The deputy opened the rear door. Before they put him inside, Mark turned toward me. "You're destroying my company over this." I looked at him for a few seconds. "You destroyed Dad's life for your company." The deputy pushed his head down and put him in the back seat. I stood in the driveway while the car pulled away. The house behind me was dark and empty. For years, Dad had called that place home. Now strangers owned it. Mom's garden was dying, and almost every dollar from the sale was gone. My lawyer came over and quietly said, "This isn't finished." I looked at the folder in his hand. I know, because arresting Mark was only the first problem. Now, we had to find out where Dad's money had gone and whether any of it could still be recovered. 4 months later, Dad was sitting at my kitchen table arguing with me about coffee. "This is terrible," he said after taking one sip. I looked over from the counter. You've said that every morning for 3 weeks. Because every morning you make terrible coffee. Then make it yourself. Dad stared at me like I just challenged him. Give me the damn machine. I laughed and moved out of the way. He got up slowly, grabbed the counter for balance, and shuffled over. He still used a cane when he was tired, but compared to the man I'd found in that room, he looked like himself again. He'd gained some weight back. His hands didn't shake nearly as much. Most importantly, his mind was clear. Sometimes he forgot little things, but according to his doctors, that was consistent with his age. The severe confusion, the blank stare, the inability to recognize me, almost all of that had disappeared after the sedatives were removed from his system. The first few weeks had been rough. Dad would wake up at night, confused about where he was. Sometimes he thought he was still in that facility. Once I heard something fall around 3 in the morning and found him standing beside the guest room door trying to find his shoes. Dad, what are you doing? He looked embarrassed. I thought they were coming with the pills. I didn't know what to say. I just walked him back to bed and stayed there until he fell asleep. Later, he told investigators that staff at the shelter had given him medication whenever he became agitated or demanded to leave. He remembered asking for his phone over and over. He remembered telling them he had 2 sons. They kept telling him his file said he had no family. Mark had apparently taken Dad's phone during the first week. Police later found it in a drawer at his office. He'd turned it on occasionally, which explained the location record that led us to the industrial area. He had also used Dad's phone to make it look active and had intercepted some of my calls before shutting it off again. The photo of Dad in the leather chair turned out to have been taken during Mark's original consultation at the Real Resort, before Dad ever sold the house. Mark had brought him there once, let him sit in the lobby, and taken several pictures. Dad thought they were touring the place. Mark saved those photos and used them later whenever I started asking too many questions. The money was uglier. Investigators traced most of it. Mark had used Dad's house sale to keep his construction company alive. He paid overdue loans, suppliers, personal credit cards, and the down payment on the SUV. He also transferred money through 2 business accounts, apparently hoping nobody would connect it directly to Dad. It wasn't some brilliant plan. It was desperate and stupid. Mark's company had been close to collapsing for months, and instead of admitting it, he saw Dad's house as a way out. The resort story gave him a reason to get Dad to sell without asking too many questions. What I still couldn't understand was why he'd gone so far with Dad. He could have stolen the money and left him somewhere normal. During one interview, Dad gave me the answer without realizing it. I told Mark I wanted to come home, he said. I told him I'd cancel everything and buy another little place. That was the problem. As long as Dad could call me, a lawyer, or the bank, Mark risked losing control. So he made Dad disappear. Different name. No family listed, no phone. A referral claiming cognitive problems and aggressive behavior. Once Dad started protesting, the medication made him easier to control. Mark stayed in jail after his arrest. His attorney tried to get bail reduced, but prosecutors argued he was a flight risk because of the money transfers and the false documents. More charges were added as investigators worked through the records. I stopped following every legal detail after a while. My lawyer handled most of it. I only cared about 2 things: Dad getting better and recovering whatever money we could. Mark's SUV was seized. Business accounts were frozen. Equipment, property, and other assets were tied up in the case. We were told it could take a long time before Dad saw any money, and there was no guarantee he'd recover everything. Dad took that better than I did. One afternoon, we were sitting on my back porch when I apologized again for convincing him to sell the house. He looked at me and said, "How many times are you planning to say that?" "As many as it takes." "For what?" "I told you to trust him." "So did I. You asked me if selling was the right thing, and you thought it was." I looked down at the deck. Dad tapped his cane against my shoe. "You flew across the country because something felt wrong. You found me. That's what I remember." I didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "Still should have let me keep those curtains." I looked at him. "The ugly flower ones?" Your mother liked them. She had terrible taste. Dad laughed so hard he started coughing, then pointed his cane at me. Don't let her hear you say that. That was the first time, since everything happened, that talking about Mom didn't make the room feel heavy. Dad lives with me now. He complains about my coffee, rearranges tools in my garage, and tells my neighbors how badly I mow the lawn. He video calls a couple of his old railroad friends every week. Some days are harder than others, but he's here. He knows where he is. He knows who I am. And every time my phone shows me one of those old messages from Mark about the pool, I think about how close I came to believing him for another month, maybe longer. I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten on that plane. And honestly, I don't want to know. Leave your thoughts in the comments.